Well, I think, if I may say, I think I know my ex-husband, Shih Ming-teh, quite well. Having worked with him for so many years and watching his development over this period of time. And I also know Hsu Hsin-liang very well because I knew him at least briefly before the Zhongli incident, and because we were together in that period of the democratic movement. And then I worked in his Formosa Weekly in Los Angeles for a year or so or more. So let's say I had contact with him overseas over on and off a period of 6, 7 years, plus the previous experience in Taiwan. And after he came back, I came back to Taiwan and he was out of prison. And Chen I also knew quite well overseas, and in fact shared my house with her for about a month. And of all these three, I mean, we would probably more expect that Shih Ming-teh would be the one who would hold his course, who would stick to his principles. Now, Hsu Hsin-liang himself came out of the KMT. From knowing him in 1978, you could always see him as a kind of gambler who was hedging his bets on several levels. And I saw him in the overseas activities tell one group of people one thing and tell another group of people another thing. He could posture as a radical, he could posture as a rightist, and basically in the end he would always go with the money. He would go with where he had somebody concrete to put up the money, and he could go through money at tremendous speeds. I mean, he would just splash it all. I mean, he's got a gambler's mentality. He did have some good strategies occasionally. I mean, his strategy in 1990 was to try to lure the Taiwanese in the KMT towards the position of, Taiwan rights, Taiwan self-determination, towards the DPP position, to try to split the KMT. That was his policy, which we could say maybe in the end it won out, but I don't know if it went out because of him or because of the general trend. But what I can say from my own information and doing some digging on information when I was still, quite often in the DPP central headquarters, is that Hsu Hsin-liang, as party chairman, began a policy of trying to get money from businesses that were very close to the KMT. Now, later on, we hear in Li Denghui's biography and elsewhere that Li Denghui did intentionally allow some money, to flow to the DPP. Okay, well, I mean, this is not surprising, even if you were Zhang Jingguo, because if you want to claim to be a democracy, you want to have an opposition, but you also want to have a emasculated opposition. So I really think a lot of this money went through local businessmen who did manage to soften the opposition of the. If I may say so, I think I dug up enough evidence that Hsu Hsin-liang encouraged corruption within the DPP and encouraged cooperation on a very local and nefarious level between KMT figures and DPP. So you might say he was welcoming the DPP to infiltration and less than a principled position. Of course, you can say he was trying to, what they usually say about Hsu Hsin-liang is he was trying to recruit the enemies, recruit people who had been kicked out of the KMT in order to strengthen the DPP. But he also lowered the quality of the DPP in the process. Now, I think...
I'm sorry, while he was chairman?
While he was chairman, yeah. Before he was chairman and while he was chairman. Now, as soon as he got out of jail in 1990, Hsu Hsin-liang had a quite clear policy of courting the Taiwanese capitalists, and that he figured this was one way, I think, to undermine the KMT. But no, he just, as he stated it, as I heard him at talks, just in principle, whatever the Taiwanese capitalist does is right. We should have no criticism of it. We should go along with it. And later on, he expanded this further to saying that, well, the Taiwanese capitalists will take over China. We don't have to talk about Taiwan independence because the Taiwanese capitalists will take over China economically. I mean, this is really megalomania. Okay, he has a whole book on this, which is basically megalomania and encouraging Taiwanese towards thinking that they are the next power, the next economic power in the world, which is, you know, pretty ridiculous given the size of Taiwan relative to China. But I think, yes, really one basic thing that we definitely should castigate Hsu Hsin-liang for is welcoming corruption into the DPP. And at one point, of course, he superficially made an effort to look like he was cleaning up, but it was just a smokescreen. And I believe also that Shih Ming-teh was led down the garden path by Hsu Hsin-liang, and I think I have.
I'm sorry, I don't know my DPP history that well.
Yeah.
What are the years when they were chairman?
I forget a little bit too, but Hsu Hsin-liang was chairman twice. He was chairman the first time in about 1991, and then he resigned just like about 6 months before the end of his term. So Shih Ming-teh, because Shih Ming-teh was the runner-up, so Shih Ming-teh was chairman for 6 months. Then Shih Ming-teh won the election for one term, and but then I can't exactly remember why, but then Hsu Hsin-liang got another term after that. So Hsu Hsin-liang was chairman then in still like 1996, the second time he was chairman. And see, they bite you, not me. Yeah, if you can get a few, that's good. It's I keep the back door open because the cat's got to run in and out. Although eventually I might think of something else to do, like put another screen door there.
Okay. So you were saying about.
Well, what I'd say, I think in the middle of his chairmanship that Shih Ming-teh tried to carry out reforms, but felt overwhelmed and gave up, and from that point on, kind of went downhill. So that was really about 1994.
You said he was led down the garden path?
Led down the garden path. That is, it's funny, I still don't blame Shih Ming-teh as much as I do Hsu Hsin-liang, but I do blame Shih Ming-teh for losing his place in history, and his defection was really totally a tremendous blow to Taiwan nationalism. And he could have been really been named as the father of the Taiwan nation if he had kept his principles. But we see that in late 95 and then 96, he began to take a position, a direction, a political direction that actually a little earlier than that, which was really putting his personal ambitions first. So I divorced him. I divorced Shih Ming-teh in mid-1995, but the crucial incidents were already the end of 94 when I told him I would not work with him any further and that I believed that he had violated basic principles of international human rights by appointing Paris Chang to be the DPP representative in Washington. And at that time people didn't believe me, but at the end of 1995, when he moved to make an unholy alliance with New Party, and then continued on from there to become more and more rubbing shoulders with the conservatives, until finally all of his Taiwan independence supporters deserted him. And then I think at that point, with probably in financial crisis, he began to accept donations from sources that were ultimately KMT sources.
before
We're-
to that?
We're pretty much done with it, but there's not too much more to say about them later.
But Shih Ming-teh still supported Chen in 2000.
No, no,
He did not.
no. Shih Ming-teh, although he was, I think, still a member of the DPP in the year 2000, I try to remember when it was he was actually left the DPP. Shih Ming-teh, I think, was it about 1997, 98, no, 1997 or so, had a falling out with Chen Shui-bian. Not just a falling out, but he began making snide comments about Chen Shui-bian from about 1997 on. And even moving up to the election of the year 2000, Shih Ming-teh was quite destructive. And he was giving talks. He was given talks in early 2000 where people who were New Party professors would introduce him to go give talks. And he would give some long rambling talk about being in prison, and then he would make a few pot shots at Chen Shui-bian. So, yeah, it was quite early.
But I must be very confused because he's clearly at the the green rallies for the 2000 election.
No, he only showed up once. What do you mean?
Oh yeah, well okay. So what was he doing? Oh okay. So if it was once, but once is what I'm referring to.
I'm not even quite sure if he showed. I think he showed up at one.
So, but if you show up at a rally, that means you're supporting, right?
It looked very doubtful. It looked very doubtful. He gave a lot of talks in which he was. I know he gave a lot of talks before Chen Shui-bian's election in which he was taking pot shots at him.
So was that appearance in 2000 insincere or?
I can't remember the details.
Oh, okay.
I think he just showed up briefly and left again.
Oh.
And I don't know if he did it to keep his position or what. I don't know.
Okay.
But I mean, from about 1997 on, he was continually making snide remarks and pot shots at Chen Shui-bian. And you have to look at in like 1993, 92, 93, 94, Shih Ming-teh had a huge following of people, hangers-on, who were expecting that he was going to be the president. That someday when the DPP did take the president, expected him to be president. And they were building up his ego to something quite untenable. So I rather look at what I see his corruption as being more a matter of his personal life, problems with his personal life, with his maintaining his sanity among all this. He's actually a very solitary kind of person. He's not really totally suited to be a politician. I mean, he's very good as a revolutionary, but as a politician, he's not social enough. He takes in flattery too easily. And in this, he's definitely not as strong as Hsu Hsin-liang. But, I mean, he was originally the person who had survived through 25 years of imprisonment, through 2 life sentences, a death sentence, and then 2 sentences of life. I mean, it's really incredible what he managed to survive. And, you know, when I was with him in the Meilidao movement, I thought he had quite a cool head, quite solid political judgment, even if he was himself a very alienating kind of person, difficult to deal with. But he seemed to show excellent political judgment and quite a solid political philosophy, as I say, till the 1994 maybe. But I could see the handwriting on the wall before that he was, you know, isolated. You know, I think in all these cases, Hsu Hsin-liang and Shih Ming-teh and then Chen Wen-chen, you know, Chen Wen-chen is a very clever woman, but she has no beliefs of her own. And she's very irresponsible on a lot of levels, mostly financial. And I guess there's a lot of other things I could say about her that I wouldn't really want to say on tape. But she doesn't have any beliefs, any basic beliefs of her own. And this didn't really come through until maybe the early 90s. And she's a person who delights in manipulating other people, including men. I mean, this, of course, is her sex pot image, right? But if you talk to her personally, you can see that she delights in manipulating people. And she's been fairly successful at it. And I think overall, what you have to see in the cases of Hsu Hsin-liang and Shih Ming-teh and Sun Wen-chen also, is that a person who is in the opposition camp, who is a big figure in the opposition camp, is worth a lot, and they can command a high price. So it's not just a matter of being simply, bought out. It's big bucks. It's big power, and for somebody of that caliber, yeah, they can command a lot of money by selling out. And I accuse them of selling out. I think Hsu Hsin-liang's direction did not change very much. I don't think for him it was that matter of selling out. He was always a person who went from one ploy to another ploy. In Shih Ming-teh's case, I think it's a much more tragic situation. And I think, it's a tragedy for the Taiwan movement overall. But if you listen, I think the thing is, if you listen to any of them, their statements over a long period of time, especially, Shih Ming-teh, since he's been taking potshots at the president since the year 2000, you can see that whatever topic he takes on is really not his expertise or from his own experience. It's something that echoes what the blues have been saying, like in the presidential versus the parliamentary issue. And, when he took this up, which was, of course, when the blues were making this issue. So I don't think he has really an independent position. And all of his posturing is pretty much just that. It's just posturing. And he hasn't laid out any, clear political philosophy or any clear political direction or any clear reason for opposing the DPP. But you can see the way both Hsu Hsin-liang and Shih Ming-teh have been used by the blues. I have it on fairly good authority that Shih Ming-teh was encouraged by a PFP member to run for Kaohsiung mayor, and he expected that they were going to support him. Well, they didn't, but he and the other DPP turncoat took about 2% of the vote. Hsu Hsin-liang ran for president against Teng Sui-bian in the year 2000, and he took about 2% of the vote. So, when there's any such close election, if you can take 2% of the vote from your opponent, it's a strategy, it's a strategy for the blues, or it's a strategy for any political party. What other reason could there be for Shih Ming-teh running for Kaohsiung mayor, or Hsu Hsin-liang running for president in the year 2000?
Did you say Hsu Hsin-liang ran in 2000 to take votes away from Chen?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I believe so. And my information is that his money came from the blue camp, and also that Shih Ming-teh running for Kaohsiung mayor what was it, 3 years ago, right? That his money came from the blues. Yeah, but you want to be president, but you're obviously not going to make it, right?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Okay.
Of course, he said he wanted to be president, but what kind of logic is that?
Okay. Okay. So since we're on the topic, what about Liao and Qingdong?
I don't really blame Liao much. I think Liao made a very important contribution to human rights early on, and we have a large group of people who did have their ideals, and were quite influential in the 1970's as a liberal group or a liberal influence within the mainlander population. Now, a lot of those people went to jail. Liao went to jail. But they have a right to their Chinese nationalism, and I don't deny them their Chinese nationalism. I just think that they have no right to deny democracy to Taiwan. If the majority of people in Taiwan vote for Taiwan's self-determination, it's their right. And to do otherwise is to suppress democracy. I think if any of the people who in the 70's stood up for democracy and human rights, if they have a consistent position, they may themselves feel that Taiwan should be part of China, and they should be completely free to propagate that position. And I don't think that Taiwan independence movement should take any moves to silence that position, or they shouldn't be considered turncoats either. But they should also not, if they have their principles, they also should not deny Taiwan the right to make its own choice. Hsu Hsin-liang was the main one who protested. He's the one. Hsu Hsin-liang went to the protest site in front of the presidential building and sat there in hunger strike and all that. And I think you kind of have to see Hsu Hsin-liang's behavior in this as the you might say the drastic or the desperate behavior of a politician who's just about forgotten. And also, some of Shih Ming-teh's behavior the same way, that they've really already been written off by their original supporters. They don't have anything new to say. In the case of Hsu Hsin-liang, we might think that he's positioning himself or trying to posture himself to be named governor of Taiwan in a future PRC dictatorship over Taiwan. I think that's about his last hope, to go to cater to the PRC. But we can't look at this too individually. I occasionally hear rumors that the PRC does try to buy off and create relations with some DPP figures. And I think, there probably are some such relations. But of course, the Taiwanese have invested in China right and left. So, come on, it's not surprising. It's not surprising if some people who are DPP or DPP supporters have invested in China. He didn't. Shih Ming-teh didn't do much. No, he didn't do anything. Shih Ming-teh, I think, he tried to kind of stay. He left the country. He intentionally left the country as if anybody would care much during the presidential election. But he did write another article taking another pot shot at Chen. And I've got copies of that article. If you want to send it, to use it, I've got copies on my computer. If I could print it out for you, I could email it to you.
Okay. So.
He's always been making vague, vague aspersions, saying, "Oh, these corrupt politicians," and so on. Now, the KMT has been loved. The KMT supporters or KMT people themselves love to say things like, "Oh, look, the DPP is only in office so long and is more corrupt than the KMT," or "There's more of a white terror than, now we have a green terror instead of a white terror." Well, this is pretty ridiculous. I mean, this is really pretty ridiculous. Now, I'm not going to stand up for the DPP and say that there's no corruption within the DPP. There is some, but it's what we call in Taiwanese we say "shao case." It's shao case compared to what came before under the KMT. Now, if these KMT figures who are claiming that the DPP is corrupt, if they were willing to look at the past record and even the recent record of the KMT and make some kind of an objective comparison, I'd have to hand it to them. If they want to look at the case of Wu Ziyuan and how, he was Wu Ziyuan or Yan Jingbiao, that were already convicted criminals and made it into the legislature, and then Wu Ziyuan particularly, who was helped out of the country at the last minute before the end of his session so he wouldn't go to jail. If they would call themselves to account on these things or call the KMT to account on these things, then I think we could talk about this in a more measured condition. But no, I mean, this is a totally ridiculous charge. At least in Taiwan, we do not have people getting arrested. We don't have people being tortured. We don't have a huge political police surveillance system. There are people all over, the blues in particular, damning the president, digging up any kind of information they want to. Which blue has gone to jail? Which blue has gone to jail for exposing information or criticizing the president? And, you just need a few more of those white terror interviews, like today of people who spent 15 years in jail for putting up some posters, for putting up anti-KMT posters in 1949, just to talk about white terror. Or even people you heard today, like Chang, who were overseas doing human rights work, who were subject to surveillance, blacklisting, threats, even though they were in the United States, you know, and think what kind of comparison is there between the 50-some years under the KMT and the current situation. Oh, you mean Hsu Hsin-liang and Shih Ming-teh's supposed democratic
and
school?
Hsu Hsin, the film director,
Yeah.
and it's,
Well, it's interesting that they got a few people into that, but I think again, this is just a sham before the election. I don't expect it's going to go anyplace.
before
You know.
the legislative election.
Yeah, it's just a I don't want to say sham, but it's like a ploy. Okay, this is another ploy before the election, and you know, it's been so many years I haven't seen Shih Ming-teh really dedicate himself to any kind of project, to any one kind of project, and you know, we haven't heard any news since supposedly they set this thing up. You know, I mean, of course, in Taiwan, the resources are polarized between the KMT and the DPP, but I think it's about time. I think within, you know, a year or two, we should see some other alternatives. I mean, the KMT is, you know, sort of gradually imploding. To me, it's been pretty ridiculous to watch some of the demonstrations over the last few years, like, you know, the KMT holding a rally on May Day in concern for unemployment, you know, with Lien Zan, one of the richest men in Taiwan, mouthing slogans and crying crocodile tears for unemployed workers. You know, when he was premier, we never heard any such thing. You know, I mean, the unemployment rate isn't any big difference from then, and you know, it's been the KMT that's been holding up social welfare in the legislature. So, you know, if they control the bucks, they want to go ahead and spend them and get their patronage out of it. But if the DPP is holding the bucks and wants to give out the goodies, they don't want the social welfare. And it's true, at least one big difference under Chen Shui-bian, from when he was mayor until now, there's been a big increase in social welfare and a big increase in community development. And I say community development that is locally controlled, not big concrete projects coming down from the center. And I could talk about this in environmental terms and social terms. South Taiwan is full of big community center buildings, big concrete monoliths that have nobody in them. At least they used to have nobody in them. And incomplete, not fully built, just left there, big concrete hulks. That's the way it used to be in the 90s. And, you know, supposedly, community development, which had no funding for the human factor, just concrete. Why? Because you can make a lot of money in kickbacks over pouring concrete. You can't see what's under that concrete. The same for these overwrought road building and water control projects. Taiwan is covered with so much concrete. And most of that concrete is just money in somebody's pocket. So, I mean, if there's a big difference, there's been a big difference. The DPP is still doing too much concrete, but the situation has changed a lot in terms of the projects that are designed, the relationship with the community, and the environmental considerations.
What did you mean by the community development is better? Have those
Cultural development, yeah.
Those buildings they built up in the 90s, are they full of kids now, or like what? Are they?
I haven't been down south enough, but some of those buildings were so badly built that they couldn't be used.
Okay.
But as far as I know, there is more use. There are new buildings being built that actually have staffs, actually have libraries in them. Things like the community college developments. Those are using, you know, live modern facilities. There's money being given to environmental activists and you know, various kinds of social activists, women's organizations, elder people's organizations. So there's a lot more money going to people. And you might say that the KMT, what the KMT tried to block, a lot of the job creation programs. Well, what were those job creation programs? A lot of them were cleanup. And I think we've already seen the effect of a lot of that community cleanup around schools. Unemployed people were given jobs of a few months at a time to do the physical labor of cleaning up the premises around schools. And yeah, we've seen an improvement in, you know, the cleanliness down, like around in the Winshan area, a lot of areas of Taipei County and other places, you can see the physical improvement. It's maybe not a sudden physical improvement because there's a lot of filth in Taiwan, but it's been looking up a little. Parks, the other things have been, parks, recreation facilities. Now, of course, some of this development started before under the KMT, after it was challenged by elections. The interesting thing is, in terms of Taiwan living environment and cleanliness, the big change is after 1993, when the government when the legislators actually began to be challenged for their position in the legislature, and they had to show something for it. When the mayors actually started to be elected, that's when everything started to look up, even before the DPP took office. But
So having direct elections does produce change in
yeah,
performance.
it really does. Yeah, it's created a lot of change. Yeah. But when Chen Shui-bian became mayor, that was a real watershed too, because whatever kinds of standards are put into effect in Taipei, very quickly filter down to the rest of the island. Are set up as a model. I think that as far as the presidential election goes, it's not as easy to buy the vote. I heard that rather like the year 2000, the KMT gave a lot of banquets and sent a lot of people on trips. I heard, just vaguely that, the KMT had been giving out some money, but really didn't see it too directly because there's less of that in Taipei than there is like down south. For the DPP doesn't have that kind of money and doesn't have that kind of machine. I think one thing to say really is that the DPP till now does not have the kind of local offices and local machine and the long-term structure of organization for, like mobilizing the society the way the KMT does. But on the other hand, it has a lot of enthusiastic people. Usually the people just like do it ad hoc. I haven't heard of any vote buying on the DPP side for the presidency. The DPP did give out a lot of social welfare, like unemployment benefits, not so much benefits in cash, but work fare, which you would call work fare, like giving unemployed people a few months of work at a rather low salary. And they do things like clean up schoolyards. And some of the work also in Aborigine areas has been for doing preservation, like cultural preservation. And you could say it's more like a kind of organized payoff, of course, because if it's a DPP administration and they're giving people money for like work training or cultural projects and all those kind of things, it's kind of like buying their goodwill. But it's not direct vote buying. Maybe that's the best thing I can say.
Or is it,
No, it's very different because the KMT does not have any internal democratic process. Okay, and it's my understanding till now, the KMT still does not have any internal primary vote process. They have some kind of a caucus way at the top and decide who's going to be the candidates. So it's not a process like the DPP with a party membership roll and hordes of people joining the party in order to vote for their candidate. They don't have any local democratic process at all, as far as I know. And this has been an issue within the KMT. Whereas, it's been for years, the DPP had a process, first of all, where the local party members voted for the candidate to, for the nominee. And there were big battles over who would get the nomination. And in fact, there were some people who, local factions who would change from KMT to DPP and bring like 500 of their supporters into the DPP to try to grab the DPP nomination, which sometimes they did successfully manage to do. So this is where a lot of the membership of the DPP this kind of empty membership has come from, what we call 人头党员, people who are kind of nominal members, but really it's just a name list that people who have money use to struggle against each other to grab the nomination. And the reason people would want to grab the DPP nomination, especially a local faction, is that there's generally like about a 30% of the electorate who they're not going to vote for the KMT no matter what. If they see a DPP label, anti-KMT label, they'll vote for that. It's kind of like a captive reservoir of votes. And a lot of people can get elected that way with plus money. So it's like, I wouldn't be surprised if in this process of voting that a lot of the more Taiwan KMT got the primary than some of the old-timers wanted. See, because a lot of the old-timers would be like going for the Chinese nationalism, but that doesn't cut much in Taiwan nowadays. So it's really hard. You got to see who's complaining from which direction, and it makes it really hard to figure out. Oh, one thing that's interesting to note is 6 months ago, everybody assumed that Sung was going to take over the KMT. That all these people we're talking to were saying that that Sung and Lian were going to actually merge the two parties again. The PFP was going to merge back into the KMT, and Sung would effectively take over the KMT. But then the Taiwanese candidates, the more Buntu candidates, complained about that against, they said, well, there should be a vote on this as to whether we should take Sung back into the KMT, and then it hasn't happened. And now recently, there's been some, I haven't been watching the news very much, okay? But then recently, there's been this battle of words between Sung and Wang Jingping. So, Wang Jingping is a big guy in the KMT. So, if they're two at odds with each other, it doesn't look like the PFP is going to join up with the KMT, and they're not going to let Sung take over. So, this is a big change from what I thought a few months ago. Well, it has been a problem within the DPP that, the DPP has grown very much out of local Taiwan society, and a lot of the habits of local Taiwan society have been developed under KMT management is, like winner takes the spoils, pork barrel. And you might say a very corrupt kind of position. I wouldn't totally say corrupt because it happens in all democratic countries too, but it doesn't always have money attached to it, that people expect to be paid for their vote or they expect to have some interest in it. Yeah, but democracy is a balancing of interests. But what's rather uglier about it is that money has been involved, and also even in the early 90s, I did some investigation within the DPP after a particularly heated primary battle, and really there was a lot of horse trading and even money buying of party votes for the nomination. This has led to a kind of empty inflation of DPP membership. People who will bring hundreds of people onto the party rolls, who are what we call 人头党员, kind of empty head party members who are not really voting from their own conscience, but their voting polls, their voting ballots are controlled by people who have money. And of course this has already gone on within the DPP for quite a long time. Some of it has been cracked down on by the center. For example, there was a struggle in Kaohsiung, I think it was about 3 years ago, a physical struggle over control of the ballot boxes at a DPP primary balloting. And a physical fight. And this revealed the fact that both sides were trying to stuff the ballot boxes. What can I say? The DPP has been rather slow on trying to enforce internal discipline in a good way or in a standardized way. But I think the overall trend has still been good, has been progressive, that DPP leaders have basically worked to cut down on the spoils of office. That is, not let public elected officials get away from profiting from kickbacks, for example, kickbacks or from public construction. So I think the cut, it used to be, maybe 80s and 90s when all this huge construction was going on in Taiwan, that if you talk to contractors, you would hear that estimated 45% of the cost of public construction was sleaze, like handing out the money to various parties and, a lot of feasting and dining and, payoff in various forms. So I think we can be confident that that figure has probably been cut to about 15% by now, under the current administration. And the quality of public construction has gone up quite a lot, as far as I can tell so far, as far as people tell me. So if, of course, there's a huge spoils of office, there's a huge amount of money sloshing around to be paid out to voters. But as a lot of this endemic corruption is slowly cut out, and I'm not saying this is cut out totally because of the efforts of the DPP, it's the effects of actually having two functioning political parties, because either side can blow the whistle on the other side, and it happens all the time. So it's not like in the martial law days where a whistleblower would probably end up being called a communist and being sent to prison. Nowadays you might risk a lawsuit, but maybe a lawsuit for libel or something, but you're not likely to risk your life, as in the old martial law days when the officials, the KMT, could get away with about anything. So I hope I've answered that well enough. Yes, there's still some, you might, level of patronage politics. In fact, considerable amount of patronage politics. But I think a more modern political system is filtering down. Now, I really think there should be more enforcement. There should be more effort at cleanup on the higher levels of the DPP. I really think so. But right now, I'm not close enough to the situation to know. I think that a lot of people in the DPP or intellectuals, they feel that the situation of struggle with China or confrontation with China and confrontation with the KMT is still too touchy, so they don't want to display their internal dirty laundry. Whereas my view has been dirty laundry always has to be taken out and shown, or it's not going to be cleaned up. I'd say that there's a series of events, right? First, there's over a year of incredible financial mismanagement and corruption by the Chinese government. And you have to see, like, some of the policies were actually put into effect. They really disappropriated the Taiwanese on a huge scale, such as changing the currency and making Taiwan currency virtually worthless, just overnight, and handing the Japanese properties to the ROC government and to the Kuomintang and to mainlanders, rather than to the Taiwanese. That you say, this property is Taiwan property that was taken from the Taiwanese or amassed by the Japanese from Taiwan. So all those things taken together, plus the increase in the price in rice and the general criminality of the nationalist soldiers. There's such a high level of abuses there that if you read George Kerr and other sources, the place was a tinderbox already. Anything could have set it off. Now, yes, after that initial massacre, the real massacre that began was on February 28th, not when the cigarette selling woman was beaten up, but the next day, when citizens marched to the government center and were machine gunned. That's really the incident which set off the rest of the Taiwan uprising. I think in a way we could describe it as an uprising, except that it was spontaneous and it was not centrally controlled, and the citizens tried to stop disruptions and come to an accommodation with the ROC government, demanding reforms. Now the figures are that there are about 400 mainlanders. About 400 mainlanders were killed. But following that, the retributions by the military sent from the mainland by Chiang Kai-shek were on such a huge scale that everything we hear, they got off the ships and began shooting their ways into the city. In fact, at first they didn't even want to get off the ships. That's one account I have from a Navy man, that they were afraid to get off. Once they got off, they began shooting, commandeering trains right away, and really, from Geelong and from Kaohsiung, just cut a bloody swath. It was whole scale terror, shooting people in the streets. And once they made the initial military, you might say, pacification, then they began picking up people pretty indiscriminately and taking them out and shooting them. And then they were settling a lot of private scores. So, I mean, most of this was not, was extrajudicial, totally extrajudicial. No legal process involved, throwing the bodies in the rivers. I've talked to people, I have friends who've given me these detailed accounts of seeing people at Geelong getting the wires stuck through their fingers and taken out in boats and thrown in the ocean and drowned. You heard one account today also of the same kind of behavior. Now the lowest figures I've heard that are now more or less recognized, a professor who worked on the population registers of figuring out how many people were killed in 228, his figure was 9,000. Other now, like, government recognized figures are 18,000. It may be hard to figure out because probably some 30,000 people escaped from Taiwan to China and Japan. So it's like any kind of situation of total sudden crackdown. There are still some people who escaped. You don't know if they disappeared, if they died, what happened to them. Some of the high figures are, up to 40,000. But, it's at some point the figure itself is not the most important event. If you accept that, 10,000 is probably a minimum, there's nothing that can justify that. And especially the way it was totally random killings, a large part of it, or if not random, it was extrajudicial killings. And what people like Raymond Myers, when Raymond Myers and Liza Han did their whitewash book, at least they didn't totally deny it. This was, of course, when Li Denghui decided that, that 228 could not be covered up; it should be recognized. Then, finally, some scholars close to the KMT took on this topic. But if you read their book, it looks like, okay, all 228 came to an end. There were these disturbances, there were unjust killings, but then the KMT learned its lesson and it went on to reform. Well, that's an out-and-out lie. That's an out-and-out lie, because the terror of 228 continued through 48, 49, the 50s, and on. I mean, for example, the man you heard today, Li Rongzong, who was involved in 228, and then in 1949 protest against the KMT that led to his almost dying in prison. And no, it was a total terror that in the early days, there's a lot of things that need to be followed up on and proved, but there are some really, really horrible stories. I mean, people just disappearing, people being taken away, held for ransom, basically for ransom by the security agencies. It's not a legal process by any means. It was a kind of semi-random process of terrorizing and exploiting the population. And the more interviews you do of the 50s, the more clear that what rampant, demonic, megalomaniac these forms of behavior these security agencies had. You know, what a lot of people also don't know is quite interesting is really there were more mainlanders picked up and executed and prosecuted than Taiwanese, or at least, let's say it was maybe 1/3 mainlanders at least. There were more mainlanders relative to their population than there were Taiwanese that went through the prisons and were executed. Well, no, it wasn't okay. You look at 228 per se. So right after 228, when Chiang Kai-shek wasn't doing too well in China, he did for a while let up on the Taiwanese population, and they didn't want to go too far because if they had to seek refuge in Taiwan, or anyway, they were too thinly spread. So they couldn't suppress people all the time. They were also afraid of U.S. public opinion. So after 228, after about the end of 47, they kind of let up for a while. But then later on clamped down again. And when Chiang Kai-shek fled the mainland, they were really in a total anti-communist hysteria. Also, aside from that, the security agencies, all those thousands of agents from China were left unemployed, or would be left employed if they actually clipped the security agencies down to the size needed in Taiwan. And I have it from Shih Ming-teh, a good source, that the intelligence agencies tried to justify a high level of expense and employment by creating a lot of quote-unquote communist conspiracies. And they could do this. I mean, you couldn't really blame the Taiwanese for being communist because, for one thing, the Japanese had uprooted the Taiwan communists quite thoroughly in the 1930s. There weren't many Taiwanese communists left to be found. If they were anti-Japanese. But the people who came from the mainland could be accused of being communist. And if any kind of a picture, I mean, most of the struggles when Chiang Kai-shek came from the mainland were within the Kuomintang itself. I mean, after the Taiwanese had already been totally terrorized in 228. And so surprisingly high levels of arrests within the security organizations themselves. Now, you can't say, if you really understand the behavior within them, you can't say surprisingly, okay? But, security agencies they breed an internal paranoia as well. That there's going to be moles, that they're infiltrators, that he's a secret communist, and, he's a secret sympathizer. So with these internal struggles and in jockeying, if a picture could be found of somebody's classmates from 10 years previous on the mainland, where some of those classmates had become ranking people in the Communist Party, or at least gone with the Communist Party in China, then that person could be accused of being a secret member of the Communist Party, and that picture would be sufficient evidence to convict them. Or not even a picture, but somebody's testimony that, well, he was together with so-and-so who was a communist. So how many people they killed or tortured to make false confessions is just, it's just mind-boggling. It's really mind-boggling, yeah.
So to follow up on the Jiayi airport thing, I'm assuming that happened after the first initial scuffle in Taipei?
Yeah, exactly. The next 2 days or so.
So is it possible that is there any logical explanation why they were shooting at farmers from the airport, or?
I don't have a logical explanation, but there's not much logical explanation for a lot of the reasons. There's not much logical explanation. But there's lots of very lurid tales from the 50s. We don't, right now I don't know how to verify them, but I keep hearing little bits of things, people who were in primary school in Mujia, which is close by here, and, when they're in primary school, seeing people shot in the, in the yard. And, there were lots of execution grounds, burial grounds, whatever, all over the city that are, archaeologically, they're gone now. But the worst one I've heard is, I'll have to find the source of what political prisoner I interviewed. I wish I taped the notes, but this one I did write down who I interviewed. Oh yeah, it was Cai Yuan, who was arrested in 1962 in the same case with Shih Ming-teh. And he was interrogated, taken into a prison, interrogated in a building which has now been demolished, but he can describe the description in great detail. And he said in 1962, when he and others were taken in, the guards laughed at them and said that, oh, well, now what we do is nothing compared to what we used to do 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we would strangle prisoners in bags, and we'd be given 5 NT, and we'd strangle them in bags. And they said that there used to be a machine in the basement of the building. The building is pretty close to the Danshui River, and it would crush a person into chopped meat, into hamburger, and the body would just be flushed out into the river through the sewage system. So quite possibly, the point is the person would just go in the front door and never be seen again. So I mean, things like this kind of a lurid, very terrifying description. I think, we would really need a huge Peace and Justice or a huge Truth and Reconciliation Commission to find out, did all of this go on? And a lot of the people who were involved, I believe, left the country. A lot of the people who were the torturers, or probably most of the people who were the real serious security people, I think, left the country by the early 80s. And there's huge out-migration of KMT people when they thought that the Taiwanese were taking over.